News and notes from around your New Orleans Saints, how ESPN projects the next 3 years for the team, and what if you had to protect 11 players from an NHL-style expansion draft? All of that on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering the New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at rockauto.com. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and don't forget to let them know that Locked On sent you. On today's episode, we're going to start off with some news and notes. Former New Orleans Saints wide receiver Ted Ginn Jr. retires. We'll take a look at some nerdy numbers to talk about some interesting things that the Saints did last season. And we'll also take a look at the salary cap implication around David Onyemata's suspension. Then in our second segment, we're going to take a look at an ESPN Plus article that kind of projects NFL teams for the next 3 seasons. We'll talk about why their evaluation of the New Orleans Saints doesn't really make any sense. And then we'll wrap up with a fun hypothetical. If the NFL were to undergo an NHL-style expansion draft, which 11 New Orleans Saints would you protect? We've got all that and much more on today's episode. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson NOLA on Twitter, your co-managing editor over at CanalStreetChronicles.com and Tuesday co-host over the National Locked On NFL podcast. We got all that and a little bit of land yet for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, your team every day. All right, family, let's kick it off with some news and notes around the New Orleans Saints. Former New Orleans Saints wide receiver Ted Ginn Jr. announces his retirement after 14 years in the NFL. Spent 3 years with the New Orleans Saints, 2017, 2018, 2019, undoubtedly with 2017 being his best season when he sort of fractured all expectations and broke through all expectations, catching more than 70% of his passes, but unfortunately didn't have the same type of productivity for the New Orleans Saints in 2018 and 2019. So they moved on from him in favor of Emmanuel Sanders in 2020, or eventually for Emmanuel Sanders in 2020. But what a successful career for a guy that was considered a bust after his first 3 seasons in Miami. Now, remember, Miami fans wanted them to draft the quarterback coming out in that draft and not Ted Ginn Jr., who was drafted early on in the first round. And then when he didn't really amount to much as a receiver, despite having over 2,000 all-purpose yards, thanks to 1,400 return yards in the kick return game, they ended up moving on from him, sent him to San Francisco, and then he spent some time with Carolina, Arizona, going back to Carolina, and then, of course, finishing with New Orleans and then Chicago to end his career after the 2020 season. So big shout out to Ted Ginn Jr., who almost sent the New Orleans Saints to a Super Bowl in 2018, and we'll just leave it at that. Next, I want to talk about some nerdy numbers as we continue on with the big stories today. Football Outsiders is a fantastic yearly almanac, and as a part of their research, I wanted to grab a couple of numbers that I thought were really interesting. Something I actually mentioned in yesterday's episode when we were talking about the amount of times that the Saints undergo or take the field, rather, with a dime package. Well, the Saints going about 24 or 29% of the time in dime, 5th most in the NFL, and they were actually pretty successful there, forcing players or forcing teams rather in those dime packages to produce at 28.5% under the usual average across the NFL when it comes to offensive efficiency. So the New Orleans Saints really, really good with 6 defensive backs on the field last year and did it the 5th most in the NFL. They also played the absolute most man coverage at 49%, according to Football Outsiders, and they spent the most time putting their slot cornerback, in this case, CJ Gardner-Johnson, in coverage, more than any other team in the NFL in terms of slot cornerback coverage ratio, 40% of the time, number 1 in the NFL there. They also had only 3.0 yards per carry allowed on defense for runs that originated from a quarterback taking a snap under center. Now, they weren't terrible when it came to runs out of the shotgun, but they defended runs from a quarterback being under center better than any team in the NFL last year. And David Onyemata, of course, was a big part of that, whose average play took place only 0.2 yards downfield. So a lot of push on that defensive line. There's another space where you're going to miss them for the first 6 games of the season. And here's something that I know a lot of Louisiana fans and a lot of New Orleans Saints fans are just going to absolutely love to hear. Please notice the sarcasm dripping in my voice. 1,005 penalty yards last season, second most in the NFL, but only 517 penalty yards against, fewest in the NFL. Now, it's actually the second straight season where the Saints have had the fewest penalty yards called against them. Take that for what you will. I'm just here to give you the numbers. Finally, let's take a look at some more numbers over on the contract side. I've got a couple of questions about this. What does David Onyemata's 6-game suspension mean for the New Orleans Saints in terms of the salary cap? The short answer is that they get $2 million back. The long answer is the reason why that happens is because his base salary of $990,000 spreads out over the course of 18 weeks, which includes the bye week, and would then have to be, he would essentially lose 6 weeks of that. So effectively 6/18, 2/3, but in contract lingo, you're just going to count it in those full numbers. So 6/18 of his contract and base salary go back to the New Orleans Saints. Likewise, he would also have to forfeit 6/18 of his, or again, 2/3 of his signing bonus back to the team as well. So those two numbers add up to be about $330,000 for his base salary, $1.55 million, or roughly that, in terms of his signing bonus that would be surrendered back to the New Orleans Saints. So that would go back to their salary cap. That puts him at about $1.89 million, so just about $2 million that ends up going back to them. However, it does not become available to the New Orleans Saints until the regular season begins. They don't get it beforehand, but they would still get that nearly $2 million back. They could then make the decision about whether or not they want to spend that, keep it as a reserve, or of course, use it to roll over into next season. So that's the way that the contract would work, and the salary cap would be affected with David Onyemata's suspension. Next up, we're going to take a look at some fun stuff. ESPN and ESPN Plus took a look at what the next 3 years might be like for NFL teams, including the New Orleans Saints, but their evaluation doesn't make much sense. We'll talk about why here in just a moment as we continue on with another episode of Locked On Saints. And speaking of the New Orleans Saints right now, according to our good friends over at BetOnline.ag, they have plus 325 odds to win the NFC South. That gives them the second best odds, actually, to win the division. They're right ahead of the Atlanta Falcons at a lowly plus 600 and well ahead of the Carolina Panthers at plus 1,000. Meanwhile, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are, of course, favored at minus 175. So if you want to get in on that, any of the other divisions, you want to take a look at NFL passing yards leader, receiving yards leader, rushing yards leader, or of course, you want to get in on this evening or Tuesday evening's matchup between the Milwaukee Bucks and the Phoenix Suns as the Bucks try to close out the finals. You can do all of that over with our good friends at betonline.ag. And of course, when you get there, don't forget to use the promo code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, so you can get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. That's a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit with the promo code LOCKEDON over at betonline.ag. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, Who Dat Nation, continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. As always, thank you very much for being here, whether you're listening on your favorite podcast provider, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're new or you've been here for a while. I appreciate very much your support. If you are new to the show, though, make sure you subscribe or follow, depending upon where you're watching or listening. And if you don't mind, take the time to drop a 5-star rating and review, as it's always very helpful for the show as we get closer and closer to the NFL season and, of course, the New Orleans Saints. Now, as we look ahead for the New Orleans Saints as well, which ESPN ended up doing in a really interesting article, I really do think it's interesting because they took a look at and they graded NFL teams based upon how they sort of match up or measure up looking ahead 3 years down the road, 2021, 22, and 23. New Orleans Saints were actually the 12th best team on this list, which I'm not actually mad at all, because I think that ranking is pretty good for where they are, especially at this moment where they have questions at the quarterback position. Now, when they looked at this, they sort of graded out 5 different spots. They looked at the roster around the quarterback. They looked at the quarterback. They looked at coaching, drafting, or their ability to draft, as well as the front office. Now, the New Orleans Saints got pretty high marks where you would expect them to get high marks, right? The roster around the quarterback was ranked 6th. Coaching was in the top 3, and you had 8th with the front office, so they still ended up in the top 10. However, drafting was the one that was the big question mark for me, and I want to tell you why here in just a second. Now, the Saints, again, had the sixth best roster around the quarterback, according to this piece. The quarterback was named 27th. And I think a big part of that is because you don't know who the quarterback is. Is it Jameis Winston? Is it Taysom Hill? Who is it? What's going on? All of that. So I do think that there's reason to knock them at the quarterback position. That makes a ton of sense. And of course, they talked about that, and everything around it made perfect sense in terms of what it was that they were looking at with the quarterback position. You're going from a Hall of Famer in Drew Brees to who? A question mark, essentially, because you don't know who you're really going to as the season begins, regardless of what all the meme accounts might be out there trying to tweet over the course of this offseason. So you look at these grades out of 100. The overall roster around the quarterback, so not including the quarterback, graded 85, so it's a high B, basically. Coaching was 91, so A, very good, or better than good, great. Front office graded 80.8, so very good there. And in the New Orleans Saints as a whole out of 100, graded 79.4. Okay, I've made you wait long enough. Now let's talk about why this doesn't make any sense. Remember how the overall roster around the quarterback was graded 6th and had a high B at 85? Drafting for the New Orleans Saints was measured at 24th in the NFL. 72.3 was the grade given, which is like a C, good. Here's the issue that I have with this, and I spoke with my good friend Dylan Sanders, who you've seen here on the show before. Please go and throw him a follow at Dilly Sanders on Twitter. Do it. This doesn't make any sense at all, because if the roster around the quarterback is the 6th best roster in the NFL, according to this piece, how is it possible that the draft is ranked only 24th, or the Saints' ability to draft is ranked only 24th, when almost every other player around the quarterback was drafted by the New Orleans Saints? Think about this. And of course, you have some undrafted free agents that are part of that too, but you always consider them a part of your rookie class as opposed to just your draft class. So I would count them in this too. But look at the 5 starters in the offensive line. Teron Armstead, drafted in 2011. Then you have Andrews Pete, drafted in 2015. Of course, Eric McCoy, your starting center, drafted in 2019. You look at Cesar Ruiz, drafted in 2020. And then, of course, Ryan Ramczyk, drafted in 2017, which, by the way, is still considered one of the best draft classes and will for a while be considered the best draft class ever in the NFL, because you look at all of these contracts that these guys have gotten since they've been in the NFL. You talk about Marcus Williams, who's on a $10.6 million franchise tag. You look at Marshawn Lattimore, who's right now on a $10+ million 5th-year option. Ryan Ramczyk just got the highest paid right tackle contract in the history of the NFL. Alvin Kamara, a highly paid top 5 running back. You look at Trey Hendrickson, who just got a boatload of money from the Cincinnati Bengals after a 13.5 sack season. And then, of course, there's Alex Anzalone, who signed a contract with the Detroit Lions for 1 year, $1.75 million. But still, despite all of that, this is still an extraordinarily good team. By the way, 3 of those players that I just mentioned got Pro Bowl nominations. That would, of course, be Marshawn Lattimore, Ryan Ramczyk, and Alvin Kamara. Oh, by the way, Marshawn Lattimore and Alvin Kamara, your offensive and defensive rookies of the year that year. You also have 9 Pro Bowlers drafted by this team, as well as several All-Pro nominations since 2011, including 2011 draft class guys like Cam Jordan and Mark Ingram, even Akeem Hicks, who's not on the team anymore. Teron Armstead is a Pro Bowler. Andrews Pete is a Pro Bowler. Michael Thomas, Alvin Kamara, all 3 of those guys that we just mentioned before, all Pro Bowlers. And if you take a look, since 2016, the New Orleans Saints draft classes ever since then, every single one of those players is still in the NFL, with the exception of Daniel Lascaux. And I think you might be able to say Tommy Stevens right now, as he's still a free agent after he was just recently released by the Carolina Panthers. But if you look at the roster around the quarterback, which graded 6th, every single one of those guys, except for Demario Davis, Latavius Murray, and Will Lutz, were either drafted by the New Orleans Saints or came in as an undrafted free agent to the New Orleans Saints. Outside of quarterback, outside of Latavius Murray, Demario Davis, Will Lutz. Everybody else originated with the New Orleans Saints, even players that went elsewhere and came back like Patrick Robinson and Malcolm Jenkins. So 24th when it comes to the draft, but the 6th overall roster, which is made up of players that you got from the draft, doesn't make a lot of sense, ESPN. Maybe work a little bit harder on that one. All right, family, in just a moment, we're going to keep having some fun here. Obviously, we don't know what the Saints are going to look like over the course of 3 years, but the fact that they look so good in the coaching, in the front office, as well as on the team around the quarterback is nothing to shake a stick at, right? We just have to see how that quarterback position pans out. But what if in the next 3 years, let's just say, the NFL added another expansion team and did an NHL-style expansion draft? Well, we're going to create that scenario. We're going to talk about 5 offensive players to protect, 5 defensive players to protect, and 1 specialist, which, by the way, means kicker, punter, or long snapper. Don't cheat. So we're going to talk about all of that and who we would protect as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And don't forget, today's episodes brought to you by our good friends over at BuiltBar.com. 9 incredible flavors that are always there for you when it comes to the best tasting protein bar on the market. Coconut almond. Imagine eating a Mounds bar or an Almond Joy bar and actually experiencing joy from it, not having to feel guilty about it at all, even though it's covered in 100% chocolate. Sounds super sweet, but only 4 or 5 grams of sugar, 17, 18 grams of protein, exactly what you need to help you get through your busy day as our days just keep getting busier and busier and busier as we continue to move on. And even some of the more sugary sounding things like salted caramel, cookies and cream, same thing. 4 or 5 grams of sugar, 17, 18 grams of protein. So go and check these out. Grab yourself a sample box. That's my big recommendation. Get 2 of each of those 9 bars in an 18-bar box over at BuiltBar.com. And don't forget to use the promo code LOCKED15 so you can get 15% off of your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 for 15% off at BuiltBar.com. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Very glad to be here with you, and thank you again for being here with me. We're going to go into a little bit of fun here. We had a little bit of fun poking fun at ESPN and ESPN Plus a moment ago, but let's talk about this idea with the NHL expansion draft happening or having on its way, as it has been, with the Seattle Kraken, which, by the way, look, I've been a Golden Knights fan, but what a fantastic name Seattle Kraken is. But with Seattle Kraken coming in, basically the way that the NHL does their expansion draft is that it's 11 players that you can protect. So we're going to mimic that. And this is really all thanks to my good friend Corbin Smith, who's the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. He's in the market with the Kraken and then took this sort of expansion draft idea and wrote a piece over at Sports Illustrated, covered it on Locked On Seahawks as well, about which 11 players he would protect. We're going to do the same thing here. And a shout out to John Sigler as well, who wrote a great piece about it over at Saints Wire. So we're going to go over 5 players on offense, 5 players on defense, and 1 specialist that we have to protect. That makes 11 total players. And we're going to say that the 2021 draft class, you can't touch them, right? Like they're protected already. So you've already got Peyton Turner, Paulson Adebo, Pete Werner, then you've got Ian Book, and then of course you wrap that up with Landon Collins and Kawan Baker. So you have all those players. Now let's talk about who are the 5 players on offense we're going to protect. I'm going to go with your 2 stars to start us off. Ryan Ramczyk and Teron Armstead. That wasn't what you were expecting, and I know it. But I would also grab those guys, Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara, and then of course Eric McCoy. So I'm grabbing 3 offensive linemen. That's how good the New Orleans Saints offensive line is. I'm going to let Adam Troutman go out there and hit the market. I think that because we haven't actually seen him on the field before, you'd be able to get him back. Some of these other players too, Traquan Smith, Marquez Callaway, these guys that haven't fully blossomed into anything yet, then you get an opportunity to potentially get them back on your team. But Michael Thomas, I'm not letting go anywhere. Alvin Kamara, Teron Armstead, Ryan Ramczyk, Eric McCoy, not letting them go anywhere. So that's my 5 on offense. My 5 on defense, David Onyemata, no matter what, especially if in this instance he's not suspended for 6 games, definitely keeping him. Demario Davis, no doubt there. And then I'm going secondary, 3 in a row. Marcus Williams, Marshawn Lattimore, and of course, CJ Gardner-Johnson. Of course, CJ Gardner-Johnson. This dude's not going anywhere. He's a New Orleans Saint for life, as far as I'm concerned. This guy's too good. So David Onyemata, Demario Davis, get 1 from each level there, and then I'm going secondary the rest of the way. Marcus Williams, Marshawn Lattimore, CJ Gardner-Johnson. And then for specialists, I'm going to go with Will Lutz. Again, specialist should mean kicker, punter, long snapper. Shout out to Zach Wood. Long snapper GOAT as far as I'm concerned, because I have no idea how to evaluate long snappers, so I'm just going to say he's the greatest to ever do it. And I'm going to go with Will Lutz and keep a guy who's right now in the top 5 when it comes to kicking percentage. Now, of course, he's only been in the league for a little while, so that's a small sample size for that number, but I'm going to roll with that, and I'm going to keep going with that. He's already one of the best kickers in New Orleans Saints history. That's for certain, despite the fact that he had a down year last year. So those are our 11. 5 on offense, 5 on defense, and then the 1 specialist. I could have maybe worked to keep Blake Gillikin or Nolan Cooney, but because you have 2 of them, and also because of the fact that no one's ever seen them before, I'm not too worried about them. You could go with a little bit more strategy here. You could bank on the fact that Ryan Ramczyk's contract is brand new and huge. You could bank on the fact that Teron Armstead is restructured, and so his money pushes to dead cap. You could bank on the fact that MT and AK just got recent contracts, but there's no way MT and AK don't get picked up by somebody in that situation, or by, the expanding team, whoever it may be, a San Antonio team, an Oklahoma City team, whatever it might be, a Baton Rouge team. Let's get it going. So I think that with all of that, I don't know that I really play much of that strategy with some of those guys, but you might be able to do that with Ryan Ramczyk and bank on the fact that it's a brand new contract, so you're not going to pick him up. Over on the defensive side, though, I don't really see anybody here that their contract would keep a team from investing in them. Even Marcus Williams, who they'd have to invest in quite a bit this season, but then would get the opportunity to potentially extend him into next season. So I wouldn't really want to play with fire there. So those are the guys that I locked down. I didn't name Cam Jordan. I was in between Cam and Marcus Williams based upon Marcus Williams' contract, but I went ahead and went with a young guy. DeMario Davis was really the age exception that I made, but you could potentially do that too, because you can let some of these older players walk, these guys on the opposite side of 30, and then hope that they can still make it back to you after the expansion draft is all done. I want to name a couple of other players that actually made the list for some of our folks that participated on Twitter as well. So if you want to answer this question, head over to at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, you can comment in the comment section below. Cesar Ruiz got a mention. Cam Jordan, of course, got a mention. Ian Book got a mention. Taysom Hill, it was as a specialist, but Taysom Hill got a mention. Deontay Harris got a lot of mentions, but I didn't include returners as specialists. I kept him as a wide receiver. Adam Troutman got a mention, and Marquez Callaway got mentions as well. And there's another way that we could do this. We could go deeper down this rabbit hole. Carly Pretty, who you should check out on Twitter, over at the Who Dat Nation chat line, asked, is this all time or just today's roster? Be interesting to think about 5 all-time offensive players, 5 all-time defensive players, and 1 specialist to keep. So maybe we'll go down that rabbit hole a little bit during training camp as well. But fun topic. Would love to see what you've got. So you can hit me up over on Twitter at Ross Jackson Nola. Drop them in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, or of course you could check it out over at the Locked On Saints Facebook group. All right, y'all, coming up tomorrow, it's Midweek Fundamentals. So we're going to break down some easy stuff. We're going to take a look at DVOA tomorrow, since I'm going to kind of dig into that over the next little bit. We might as well set the scene and kind of refresh on what DVOA actually means and how to measure it. And of course, we'll keep you up to date with all the big news around your New Orleans Saints. We have so much coming up for you with training camp right around the corner. And as always, I thank you very much for everything that you do to keep us going here over at Locked On Saints. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Today podcast, with the Milwaukee Bucks just 1 win away from getting their finals championship. You want to go and check out what Peter Bukowski has to say about that and the rest of the big news around the sports world in less than 20 minutes. We'll be back with you tomorrow. As always, y'all, I am Ross Jackson. You can find me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.